When I faced losing my family's farm to greedy developers after 50 years of serving as a secret military training ground, I thought our legacy of supporting our troops was over forever. But one desperate sign and a phone call from the highest levels of the Pentagon would prove that some traditions are too valuable to lose, and that the military never forgets those who serve behind the scenes. You will not believe what happened next. Hi everyone, welcome to Life's Changing Stories. Now let's dive into today's stories. Frank Morrison was 74 years old and had worked the same 1,200 acres of Missouri farmland his entire life. Morrison Ranch wasn't one of those massive corporate operations taking over the countryside. It was a family farm, the kind that was becoming rarer every year. But what made their place truly special wasn't the corn or soybeans they grew. For 3 generations, the Morrison family had quietly served their country in a way most people never knew about. The story started with Frank's grandfather, Samuel Morrison, back in 1941. When Pearl Harbor was attacked and America entered World War II, Samuel offered their largest field to the Army Air Forces as a training ground. The military needed places where their pilots could practice emergency landings, and their flat, open south pasture was perfect. What began as a patriotic gesture during wartime became a family tradition that would span 8 decades. Frank's father, Robert, continued the tradition through Korea and Vietnam. He'd spend countless nights setting up landing markers for young pilots, learning to navigate in darkness, understanding that the skills they practiced on the Morrison farm might one day save their lives in combat. And when Frank took over the farm in 1975, he inherited more than just land and livestock. He inherited a sacred responsibility to support the military. For 35 years, Frank had maintained that landing zone in their south pasture. Helicopters from Whiteman Air Force Base, 3 states away, used their fields for critical training exercises. He'd watched thousands of young pilots learn to handle everything from routine landings to emergency procedures on their property. Frank and his wife Dorothy had always considered it an honor. She'd prepare fresh coffee and sandwiches for the crews during long training sessions, especially during winter exercises when the men and women were working in brutal conditions. Frank had kept that field clear through droughts, floods, and harvests, always prioritizing military readiness over farm profits. During planting season, he'd work around the training schedules. During harvest, he'd delay cutting corn if a training exercise was planned. The crews knew they could count on Morrison Ranch no matter what. The local community understood what the Morrisons did, even if they didn't talk about it much. In small-town Missouri, supporting the military wasn't something you bragged about. It was just what you did. But everyone in Clearwater County knew that when helicopters flew overhead, heading toward Morrison Ranch, it meant their boys and girls were training to keep America safe. Everything changed last spring when Mega Development Corporation bought up all the land surrounding the Morrison farm. These Silicon Valley types saw their quiet corner of Missouri as the perfect spot for their new tech campus. Innovation Valley, they called it. One by one, Frank watched his neighbors sell out for prices that seemed impossible to refuse. The Montgomery family sold their 200 acres where helicopters used to make emergency landings during bad weather. The Petersons sold their place that had served as a backup landing zone for over 20 years. Even the old Henderson farm, where Frank's father used to store extra fuel for military exercises, was marked for development. The developers came to see Frank on a Tuesday morning in June, arriving in matching BMWs that looked completely out of place on their gravel driveway. They offered him 3 times what the land was worth, promising to make him wealthy beyond his dreams. "Mr. Morrison," the lead developer said, spreading glossy architectural drawings across Frank's kitchen table, "you could retire in luxury with what we're offering. Think about it. No more worrying about weather or crop prices. You could travel the world, buy a mansion in Florida. Frank looked at those drawings showing gleaming office buildings and parking lots where their South Pasture training ground had been. "This land isn't for sale," he told them simply. They laughed, thinking he was negotiating. They raised the offer, then raised it again. When they reached an amount that would have set up Frank's grandchildren for life, he stood up from the table. "Gentlemen, there are some things money can't buy. This farm has served our military for 3 generations. That's not something I can put a price tag on." But they didn't give up. Over the following months, they bought every piece of land around the Morrison Ranch until it became an island surrounded by their development. They filed lawsuits claiming the farming operations were incompatible with their tech campus. They complained to the county about noise from military helicopters. They made Frank and Dorothy's lives miserable in every legal way possible. The breaking point came in October when Frank received an eviction notice. Despite the family's ownership going back over a century, some legal technicality involving mineral rights was going to force them out. The lawyers said they had 30 days. 30 days to end a tradition that had survived World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless smaller conflicts. 30 days to abandon a commitment that Frank's grandfather had made with a handshake and that the family had honored for 83 years. That evening, as Frank sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the South Pasture, where so many young pilots had learned to fly, he felt older than his 74 years. Dorothy came out and sat beside him, both of them understanding that they were watching the end of everything their family had built. "What are we going to tell the crews?" Dorothy asked, her voice breaking. "Some of those pilots have been training here for 15 years. This is the only place they know." Frank didn't have an answer. How do you explain that decades of service mean nothing when corporate lawyers get involved? The next morning, with hands that shook from anger more than age, Frank hammered a sign into the ground by their front gate. It read, "Notice, Military Training Zone Closing. Morrison Ranch, serving our forces since 1941. Below that, in smaller letters, he added, "Thank you for 82 years of service to our country." Writing those words made everything feel terrifyingly final. Frank didn't tell the military about their situation right away. What was the point? They were busy with real wars and real problems. They didn't need to worry about one old farmer in Missouri. But people around town started noticing Frank's slumped shoulders and the sadness in his voice when they asked about the farm. A young reporter from the Clearwater Gazette, Jenny Walsh, drove out to take pictures of the sign and ask about their story. For 2 hours, Frank told her about his grandfather's handshake, deal with the army, about watching his father guide helicopters through fog and snow, about the thousands of pilots who'd learned crucial skills on their land. "Mr. Morrison," she said as she packed up her camera, "this isn't just a local story. People need to know what your family has sacrificed for our military." Her article appeared in the weekend edition, complete with a photo of Frank standing next to the sign, their training field stretching out behind him. He didn't think much would come of it, just a nice way to document the family's service before it ended forever. But that article started spreading through military social media channels like wildfire. Veterans who'd trained at Morrison Ranch began sharing their memories. Pilots posted photos from exercises they'd conducted on the Morrison land. Stories poured in about emergency procedures they'd practiced, night landings they'd mastered, and the hot coffee and sandwiches Dorothy had provided during brutal winter training sessions. A helicopter crew from Fort Campbell shared a photo of themselves with Dorothy from 2018, calling her the Angel of Morrison Ranch. A pilot now stationed in Germany wrote about how the confidence he'd gained training on the Morrison farm had saved his life during a combat mission in Syria. A retired colonel posted a long tribute to Frank's father, describing how Robert had once driven his tractor out in a blizzard to clear snow from the landing zone, so a training exercise could continue. The shares and comments kept growing. Hashtag Morrison Ranch started trending among military personnel. But Frank figured it was just people being nice. There was nothing anyone could actually do to save the farm. He was wrong. On a Thursday evening in late October, the Morrisons' old landline rang during dinner. Dorothy answered, then handed Frank the phone with a confused expression. "Frank Morrison?" the voice asked. "Yes, this is Frank. Please hold for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff." Frank nearly dropped the phone. Dorothy saw his face and moved closer, both of them staring at the receiver like it might explode. "Mr. Morrison, this is General Patricia Hayes. I hope I'm not interrupting your dinner." For a moment, Frank couldn't speak. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the highest-ranking military officer in the entire United States, was calling his farm in Missouri. "No, ma'am," he finally managed. "Not at all. I'm honored. Mr. Morrison, I saw the story about Morrison Ranch. I want you to know that your family's service hasn't gone unnoticed at the highest levels of our military." For 20 minutes, she asked about their operations, how they maintained the landing zones, what kind of training they supported, how many pilots they'd helped over the years. "General," Frank said, his voice cracking with emotion, "we've just been doing what felt right. Supporting our troops has always been an honor, not a burden." "That's exactly why I'm calling," she replied. "Mr. Morrison, facilities like yours are becoming extinct, and we can't afford to lose them. Your ranch has trained pilots who've gone on to serve in every major military operation of the past 4 decades. The institutional knowledge and training value of Morrison Ranch is irreplaceable." She paused, and Frank could hear papers rustling in the background. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to give me 24 hours. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and don't lose hope. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, ma'am," Frank said, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone. "I can do that." After hanging up, Frank turned to Dorothy, who was crying and laughing at the same time. "The chairman of the Joint Chiefs just told us not to lose hope," he said, still not quite believing it himself. That night, neither of them slept. They sat on the porch, holding hands and watching for helicopters that might never come again, but somehow feeling more hopeful than they had in months. The next morning, Frank was feeding the cattle when he heard a familiar sound, rotor blades approaching from the east. But this wasn't one of their usual training helicopters. This was an Apache attack helicopter, flying low and fast toward their south pasture. Behind it came 3 Blackhawks in perfect formation, their military markings crisp and official. Frank had never seen helicopters like these on his land. These were from the Pentagon's own fleet, with special insignia that marked them as VIP transport. Dorothy came running from the house as the helicopters settled onto their landing zone with military precision. The Apache remained airborne, circling their property like a guardian angel. 2 men in army dress uniforms stepped out of the lead Blackhawk, each carrying a leather briefcase and moving with the bearing of senior officers. Behind them came a woman in navy dress blues with stars on her shoulders, an admiral, moving toward them with purpose and authority. "Mr. Morrison," the lead general called out as they approached. "I'm General Marcus Webb, and this is Admiral Sarah Chen. We're here on direct orders from the chairman to ensure Morrison Ranch stays exactly where it belongs, serving our military." The 3 officers sat with Dorothy and Frank at their kitchen table, the same table where the developers had spread their glossy plans just months before. But instead of offering to buy their land, these officers were here to save it. "Mr. Morrison," Admiral Chen explained, opening her briefcase and removing official documents. "Effective immediately, Morrison Ranch is being designated as a protected military training facility under the National Defense Authorization Act. This designation makes it impossible for any civilian entity to force you from this land. General Webb pulled out additional paperwork. Furthermore, the Department of Defense is entering into a long-term lease agreement for your south pasture and surrounding training areas. This lease provides steady income while ensuring the facility remains in your family's control. Frank's hands shook as he signed the documents, Dorothy crying with relief beside him. But the officers weren't finished. "Mr. Morrison," General Webb continued, "the chairman wanted us to deliver a message personally. She said to tell you that in a world where everything seems to have a price, it's people like your family who remind us that some things are truly priceless. Your service has helped train pilots who've saved countless lives, completed impossible missions, and brought our soldiers home safely. That kind of contribution can't be measured in dollars." Admiral Chen added, "She also wanted you to know that protecting Morrison Ranch isn't just about preserving one training facility. It's about sending a message that America values the families and communities who support our military, even when that support happens behind the scenes." Within hours of the military's arrival, everything changed. The same officers who'd explained the Morrisons' protected status to them paid a visit to Mega Development Corporation's temporary offices in town. They presented federal orders declaring Morrison Ranch and surrounding areas as crucial to national security, effectively ending the developers' plans for Innovation Valley. But the military's intervention went beyond just the Morrison farm. The Montgomery property, the Peterson place, the old Henderson farm, all the land that had historically supported military training was included in the protection order. Families who'd thought they had no choice but to sell suddenly found themselves with options they'd never imagined. The developers, faced with federal intervention and the impossibility of building their tech campus around protected military installations, eventually moved their project to a different state. Innovation Valley became an abandoned dream, replaced by something far more valuable: the preservation of a training ground that had served the nation for over 8 decades. Today, Morrison Ranch stands stronger than ever. At 74, Frank still maintains those landing zones, though his grandson Jake has joined him in learning the family tradition. The training schedules are busier than they've ever been, with new types of aircraft and more advanced exercises taking advantage of their protected status. Dorothy still makes sure every crew has hot coffee and fresh sandwiches, though she's started teaching Jake's wife, Maria, the recipes and routines. The military has provided funding for improved facilities, better lighting for night training, updated communication equipment, and weather monitoring systems that make their operations safer and more effective. Frank still stays up late for night training exercises, understanding that the skills these young pilots learn in their pasture might one day save lives in places he'll never see. Every landing they practice, every emergency procedure they master, every confident decision they make under pressure, it all starts here. On land, his grandfather offered to his country with nothing more than a handshake and a promise. The original closing notice sign now hangs in their barn, not as a memorial to what they almost lost, but as a reminder of what they almost gave up fighting for. When visitors ask about the chairman's phone call or the Pentagon's intervention, Frank prefers to talk about more practical things: the new landing lights they've installed, the updated approach patterns they're testing, the next generation of pilots who'll learn their craft on Morrison Ranch. Because that's what this has always been about. Not headlines or recognition, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that their little piece of Missouri has helped train the finest military pilots in the world. The developers saw prime real estate with profit potential. The military saw something far more valuable, a tradition of service that couldn't be replaced at any price. What happened to Morrison Ranch proved that, in a world increasingly driven by money and development, there are still institutions and traditions worth preserving. Some things, like the commitment to serve our country, the bonds between military families, and the communities that support them, and the knowledge passed down through generations of service truly are priceless. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people with the power to protect those things are listening, ready to ensure that the most valuable legacies aren't lost to the highest bidder. Morrison Ranch will continue training pilots long after Frank is gone, just as it did long before he was born. That's not just the Morrison family's gift to their country, it's their country's gift to them. The knowledge that service and sacrifice still matter, and that some promises, once made, are never forgotten. We hope you enjoyed today's story of love, life, and betrayal. For more free stories and entertainment from our channel, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe with notifications.